What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back, everyone. This is Lee, and yes, today's the day we'll be talking about the Nikon D850 versus the Nikon Z6II. And right before we get started, I want to point out that this is probably the last Nikon Z6II video on this channel for evaluation. I have nothing planned after this. This is the last one in my library. This is like nothing but empty spaces for the Nikon Z6II. So with all that said, thank you guys for watching this whole entire series. I appreciate your time. And also, if you guys have any suggestions in moving forward of what kind of videos you guys want to see, definitely leave comments down below. That would definitely help me. And also definitely click like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And also, last but not least, definitely check out the merch store. It definitely helps out the channel. And with all of that out the way, let's talk about the Nikon D850 versus the Nikon Z6II. So let's begin. So the Nikon D850 versus the Nikon Z6II. The first thing you would notice is the price tag. It's $3,000 versus $2,000, and that's a $1,000 difference. Now, for everyone that knows about the D500, you guys heard that it was just discontinued, which is a huge bummer to me because that's an excellent APS-C DSLR camera, and I made a review about that actually, and it's still one of the best ones out there, and they discontinued that model. So with that said, if you guys are planning to purchase a D850, make sure you understand that there might be a potential discontinue, which means that future support may not be there for you guys. So just keep all that in mind. But anyways, in terms of the sizing of the mirrorless versus DSLR, Nikon D850 versus Z6II, obviously the D850 is a lot heavier than the Z6II. It's about 915 grams on the D850, whereas the Z6II is 705 grams. Now, in terms of the back portion of the camera, the D850 has the OVF, obviously, whereas the Nikon Z6II has the EVF. And also, the monitors. This is interesting. I totally forgot about this. The monitors on the D850 is a lot more detailed than the Z6II. That is something that I totally forgot about, but that's something for you guys to know. But it's not that big of a difference. It's just negligible, so keep that in mind. And also, both camera systems do have the touch capabilities. Now, in terms of release dates, the Nikon D850 is quite, it's 2017 of August, whereas the Z6II is November 2020. And of course, we have the first ever BSI on the Nikon D850, but it did not have the IBIS on the DSLR, whereas the Nikon Z6II do have the BSI and the IBIS, so that's something for you guys to definitely take note of. Now, the D850 is the XP5, obviously, and of course, the Z6II is the brand new XP6, so that is very interesting. Now, in terms of video, the D850, it's still usable. I mean, it's 4K, 24 frames per second, and 30 frames per second max, and that's the highest you can go. That's basically it, whereas the Nikon Z6II, you could do your 24, your 60 frames per second, and also you could do the external stuff, right? The 10-bit, the 12-bit with the external monitor. So if you're looking for video capabilities, definitely Z6II is the way to go. Now in megapixel, obviously the Nikon D850 is the 45 and the Z6II is 24 megapixel. And if you take a look at the face detection, definitely the Z6II has more face detection than the Nikon D850. And that is very interesting, but the D850 do have 99 cross types, so that is pretty good. Now, in terms of low light sensitivity, definitely a Nikon Z6II seem to do slightly better than the D850, so keep that in perspective. Now, in terms of the media format, you could use the same type of cards on both cameras. You could use the XQD, CF Express, and the UHS-2. And when you look at the continuous shooting, the frames per second on the Nikon D850, it could show up to 7 frames per second. And if you get the battery grip, you could go up to 9 frames per second. Now, for the Z6II, obviously it's going to vary, but it's about 14 frames per second to 10 frames per second. And depending on which tracking mode you're on, it goes up to 5.5 frames per second. So there you go. And in speaking about frames per second and cards and all that goodness, let me show you guys the CF Express versus the XQD on the D850. Now, as you can clearly tell, it seems like the XQD and the CF Express, they start off the same. Midway through, they kind of like, they do the buffering. But towards the end, the XQD card just gives out. It just gives out. So if you need that type of shooting experience, definitely the CF Express is the way to go. Now here's a D850 at continuous high with the CF Express card. Here is the Nikon Z6II at continuous low with the CF Express card. Now here is both cameras on top of one another, and as you can clearly tell, the Z6II, even at continuous low, will give you more shots than the D850 at continuous high. Also, if you take a closer look, the shutter curtains on the D850 is quite loud. So that is an important note to write down if you're doing wildlife photography. Here's a D850 at continuous high with a CF Express card. Here is the Z6II at continuous high with the CF Express card. Now here is both cameras on top of one another. And as you can clearly tell, just like before, you get more shots with the Z6II than the D850. And also, the loudness of these shutter curtains is, D850 is quite loud. Now here's the D850 again at continuous high with the CF Express card. Now here's the Nikon Z6II at continuous high extended with the CF Express card. Now here's both cameras on top of one another. And as you can clearly tell, the Z6II will give you more shots and it's a lot quieter than the Nikon D850. So there you have it. Alright, so here's our first scene. On the left is the Z6II, on the right is the D850. Already, as you can clearly tell, the Z6II seems to be a little bit more punchier, saturated than the D850. And also, I want you guys to make a note. We are outdoors on a cloudy day and we're about maybe 1 minute apart, so maybe a cloud may have shift here and there, but just keep all that in mind. Definitely the Z6II seems to be slightly more saturated and a little bit more punchier than the D850. Now here's the next scene, and already right off the bat, I will have to say that the Nikon Z6II seems to be just a hair tad brighter or saturated than the D850, but in my honest opinion, this is not a big deal. It's a small thing, but this is a thing that I need to point out, of course, in case you guys are wondering. But yeah, definitely I will have to say that the Z6II is just a hair more punchier than the D850. Here's the next scene. Already right off the bat, it looks like the story remains the same. The D850 seems to be just a tad darker than the Z6II, but it's not a big deal. But this is something that I kind of noticed between each cameras. In this playground scene, it looks more or less this. I think Z6II is just a tad brighter than the D850. Yeah, just a tad brighter, a little bit more sat, just a hair sat. There's no real huge difference. If you're doing post after this, you could definitely match it afterwards if you wanted to, but this is just me being nitpicky so someone can be happy out there just to know what's going on. But definitely the Z6II is just a tad more punchier than the D850. There you go. It must be the XP6 versus the XP5, so yeah. Now here's everyone's favorite part of my videos, the dynamic range portion. Keep in mind nothing at the bottom has been tuned and tweaked, and I'm just pushing out the exposure. And yeah, look at that. The Z6II will fall apart versus the D850, and that was a very dark scene. So for those people that are wondering the biggest difference between D850 and Z6II, this is a really huge difference. If you're shooting a lot of landscape, I would definitely promote the D850 over the Z6II. So there you have it. Look at that. All that red and purple, magenta, all of that stuff is there. The D850 seems to maintain the color accuracy even at very dim cases. In this next scene, the playground scene, again, it looks like, can you guys tell? I could tell. I don't know if you guys see or not, but I do see the slight magenta shift at the bottom of the ground. But for most people, they can't tell. But since we're doing side by side, you can clearly tell. So definitely there'll be a magenta shift if you're definitely pushing the darkness on the Z6II file. So yeah. Here's the next scene. I'm shooting outdoors, cloudy day as well. Nothing has been tweaked. I'm just pushing out the exposure, and here's the results. That is crazy. That is nuts. The Z6II cannot beat the D850 in terms of dynamic range. You're gonna end up getting the magenta stuff in your photo. And yeah, so if you're a D850 owner right now, you're probably really happy because you know, even though the Z6II have the Z lens, all the sharpness of the glass, the D850 still has the better dynamic range than the Z6II. So there you go, look at that. Big difference. Here's the next scene. And again, I did not tamper with anything. Everything is very clear at the bottom. None has not been tampered with. Pushing out the exposure, hitting C. Let's zoom in. And look at that. That is, yeah, look at that magenta shift. Yeah, all cases, look at that. Yeah. So Z6II just can't handle the push when it comes to extreme darkness. So definitely kudos to the D850. Here is a indoor scene, and already right off the bat, look at the indoor scene. I did the same exact thing. I shot the object in a dim light situation, and definitely the Z6II will turn into this slight magenta tone. And yeah, kudos for D850. Kudos to D850. Now here's the ISO test. I downsampled the D850 to match with the Nikon Z6II. And let me tell you guys, I think that the D850 is just a tad noisier once you downsample it versus a Nikon Z6II. Just a tad noisier, but you can't tell if you've never seen them side by side like this. So that's just me on my end, but real world usage, it's just, it doesn't matter. And also, if you take a look at the subtle brightness on the Z6II, it's, yeah, just a tad brighter. So that tells me that definitely the Z6II, it's a little bit punchier than the D850. So just to wrap things up, the Nikon D850 versus the Nikon Z6II, both cameras have their pros and cons, but let's talk about the Nikon D850. What's the pro? The pro is you have great battery life, right? You have a robust system, right? You add on a battery grip and you are out there for hours, whereas if you're a Nikon Z6 owner just like me, you will have several batteries, which also is another thing to bring up. The D850 could take third-party batteries, whereas the Nikon Z6II, you cannot, as of today, that I know of, you cannot take a third-party battery, which is a huge bummer, but I get what they're trying to do, but it's just expensive, right? So keep that in mind. Also, the D850, another pro is that the dynamic range did really well, but some of the cons with a D850 is that you don't get the Z lenses. Also, you don't get the video capabilities, and also you don't get the eye tracking stuff. Yeah, video tracking, all that tracking stuff, you don't get that on the D850. And also, you don't get IBIS, so that's something else you don't get on the D850. Now, as for the Nikon Z6II, what is the con on the Nikon Z6II versus the D850? Well, number one, it's not robust as the D850. Number two, battery life, mirrorless, obviously, of course. Number three, the dynamic range on the Z6II does not beat out the D850, which is, yeah, it's grandpa. You can't still beat the grandpa right there. But definitely you do get the frames per second, you do get the video capabilities, you do get the Z mount lenses, you can use the F mount lenses. Also, you get to do eye tracking and all that cool stuff. Now, let me talk about something really important. In my test, you guys saw the frames per seconds, right? Let me bring up this topic right here. This is a separate topic from everything else. Let's just talk about it. The shutter on a D850 is really loud. No one can go against me on that. You can see the audio levels. The D850 is relatively loud, and in today's standards and wildlife, that is a no-no if you're shooting outdoors with hunters and other shooters out there. Now, if you're shooting the zoo, some indoor event or something, you're perfectly fine. Also, the OVF is excellent. Now, with the Z6II, you do get the frames per second. You do get that quiet shutter slap. However, there is something that I did not talk about in my video about the Z6II. It has blackouts and lag. It's very horrendous. I don't like to over-predict my shots because when you're shooting wildlife photography, you don't know what a bird is thinking or where it's going. And if you need to deal with the blackouts and lag, you're basically shooting in the past all the time, and you will always need to over-predict your shot. That is something that I experienced with the Z6II and the Z7II, and it's just not a fun experience. I know that Nikon, they have their reps out there using the Z6II, Z7II, this mirrorless movement, but doing wildlife on it, it's not fun at all. I need to always overshoot, which means I'm killing out my shutter count. But in the end, if I had to do wildlife photography with one of the other system, I would have to say I would go with the D850. And I'll just deal with the noise with the hunters. Well, you know, the hunters, they might purposely shoot at your direction just to mess with you. But anyways, that's just my honest opinion. I don't like the Z6II in wildlife photography. I have done it before. I have done many videos about it, and a lot of you guys end up noticing it. And it's just, it's weird. It's a 90-day. I mean, I'll rather take the OVF versus EVF with the Nikon system, because the other system currently right now, the Canons and Sonys, they have their animal tracking all built in already. We're waiting for the Nikon Z6III to have their animal tracking stuff. So with all that said, thank you guys for checking me back. Sorry, I went off tangent right there. I'm out of here. Take it easy. Peace.